Alright, welcome back. It's Christian. This is part 10 of our series. Wow, didn't know it was going to be that long, but anyway, thanks for coming back, thank you for watching, and let's get to it, alright? So, we're talking about the 7th and final red flag, alright? The 7th red flag states that if an influencer has a history of lying or hypocrisy, then that kills the influencer's credibility. As we established in the previous video, part 9, alright, we have found that Paul and Eddie both have a history of lying and hypocrisy. Because they have a history of lying and hypocrisy, their credibility goes down a lot. Alright? Given that they have a history of lying and hypocrisy, they pretty much are not credible on anything, and you could safely disregard anything they say. Now we're going to talk about Mario, okay? Because this red flag applies to Mario, alright? So let's get into it. Alright? And I'll put a video on this in the description below. I always put my sources in my videos, in the description more specifically. So, Mario, as you'll find, has a history of contradicting himself in his videos. Alright? Given that he has a history of contradicting himself, it seems pretty apparent that he lies when he contradicts himself. So there's this YouTuber named Denali Gordon. And Gordon has looked at a lot of Mario's videos, and he shows that Mario tends to contradict himself quite frequently in his videos. For example, in one video, Mario claims that it's a bad idea to do cardio in order to lose weight. Alright, in this video, Mario says, doing cardio is a bad idea if you want to lose weight. However, in this video right here, Mario says that doing cardio is a good idea if you want to lose weight. Wait a minute, he's contradicting himself, right? In this video, Mario says doing cardio is a bad idea if you want to lose weight. In this video, Mario says doing cardio is a good idea to lose weight. He's contradicting himself. When somebody contradicts himself that quickly in two different videos within a reasonably short amount of time, there's a word for that. It's called lying. Alright? And it's not just that, okay? Consider two other videos that Mario's done. Alright? Mario, in this video, says that sitting down to exercise is a dumb idea. Alright? He considers it to be suboptimal or something like that. So in this video, he says, sitting down to exercise is a bad idea. In this video, Mario, check this, sits down to exercise. So in this video, Mario says, sitting down to exercise is a bad idea. In this video, Mario says, or rather, Mario does in fact sit down to exercise. So in this one, he says, sitting down to exercise is a dumb idea, but then he sits down to exercise in this one. He's contradicting himself. Not to mention, it's really hypocritical for him to say, don't sit down to exercise, when he himself sits down to exercise. That's hypocritical. And that hypocrisy tanks his credibility. So, as we established, or as Denali Gordon established rather, Mario has a history of lying and hypocrisy in his own videos, which no doubt hurts his credibility. And it gets even worse, because as we talked about earlier, Mario argues that it's unhealthy to consume protein powder and protein bars because they are heavily processed. Alright? Mario argues that consuming protein supplementation is not healthy. And he considers protein supplementation to be unhealthy on the grounds that it's heavily processed. Despite this, he recommends eating heavily processed candy right before a workout. Alright? That's hypocritical, don't you think? So Mario says on one hand, it's not okay to consume heavily processed protein powder or protein bars, but over here, he says it's totally okay to consume heavily processed candy before a workout. So in this corner, alright, he says, don't consume protein supplements because they're heavily processed, while in this corner, he says, you should consume heavily processed food before a workout. The food being candy, more specifically, in this one. So, simply put, he is simply a hypocrite when it comes to heavily processed food. He is hypocritical, plain and simple. If it's not okay to consume heavily processed protein powder before a workout, then it also should not be okay to consume heavily processed candy before a workout. All right? So his contradiction on this issue is hypocritical, plain and simple. So you can watch more of the video if you want, but yeah, Denali Gordon shows pretty thoroughly that Mario has a history of contradicting himself, of lying, and straight up hypocrisy. So I think that kills whatever credibility he has. Not that he had a lot to begin with. So, that's about it for Mario on the 7th red flag. If you're still here watching it, thank you for watching. And I'll conclude this series right here with some final thoughts, alright? We went over a lot of red flags, alright? The 7 red flags, like I talked about, are no credentials regarding nutrition, demonizing healthy food, criticizing processed food with no context or nuance, demonizing protein supplementation, a don't eat this at all kind of attitude, aka an all or nothing approach to food, claiming that diet can fix a problem when diet genuinely cannot fix that problem, and finally the 7th red flag, a history of lying and hypocrisy. Those are the 7 red flags that we talked about in this series. So let's briefly review the red flags as they apply to Paul, Eddie, and Mario. So let's look at Paul first. Does the first red flag apply to Paul? Not really. He has a certification in nutritional science, so the first red flag does not apply to him. However, the second red flag absolutely applies to him. The second red flag is where an influencer demonizes healthy food. If an influencer demonizes healthy food, that kills the influencer's credibility. I'll put the studies in the description below, but Paul demonizes healthy food. Paul demonizes broccoli and vegetables as being unhealthy, despite the fact that data overwhelmingly shows that broccoli and vegetables are healthy. And like I said, I'll put those studies in the description below. So the second red flag applies to him. The third red flag is when an influencer demonizes processed food with no context or nuance. This definitely applies to Paul. The third red flag applies to him. He argues that all processed food, including protein powder, is not safe to eat, although he weirdly and hypocritically sells a protein powder in his store. Weirdly enough. The fifth red flag is an all or nothing attitude with respect to food. This red flag applies to Paul absolutely. He argues that you should never consume vegetables at all, despite the fact that the data overwhelmingly shows that it's safe to consume vegetables. There are some people who can't eat vegetables, to be fair, but they're a small, minute minority. Most people should eat vegetables. Alright, the sixth red flag is where an influencer claims that diet can fix a problem, that diet genuinely cannot fix the problem. This red flag does not apply to Paul. The seventh red flag, as we discussed in the previous video, he has a history of lying and hypocrisy. So, with Paul, let me check really quick here. That's 5 out of 7 red flags that apply to Paul Saladino. Accordingly, given that 5 out of 7 red flags apply to Paul, he is not credible when it comes to nutritional advice, and I would not recommend listening to him. Whatever nutritional advice he gives is probably really bad, given that 5 out of 7 red flags apply to him. So yeah, Paul Saladino is not credible when it comes to nutrition. Let's look at Eddie really quick. The first red flag absolutely applies to him. The first red flag is where an influencer has little to no education regarding nutrition. Eddie, from what I could gather, has no education, no certification, no degree in nutrition whatsoever. Whatever education he does have is very minimal. So this red flag certainly applies to him. The second red flag is where an influencer demonizes healthy food. This red flag absolutely applies to Eddie. Eddie claims that non-berry fruit is not healthy, despite the fact that data overwhelmingly shows that non-berry fruits are safe to eat and give real nutritional benefits. And I know there's going to be people in the comment section saying, some people can't eat fruit. Yeah, they're a minority. I'm not talking about them. Some people cannot eat fruit, but they're a minority. Most people can safely eat fruit, and the studies show they should eat fruit. So anyway, back on track, the second red flag is when an influencer demonizes healthy food. And yes, this red flag applies to Eddie, because he demonizes non-berry fruits, despite the fact that non-berry fruits are safe to eat according to the data. The third red flag is where an influencer demonizes processed food with no context or nuance. And yes, this red flag applies to Eddie. The fourth red flag is demonizing protein supplementation. This applies to Eddie. He considers protein powder, protein bars, and whatever to be unhealthy to eat, although he hypocritically sells a protein powder in his gym, weirdly enough. The fifth red flag is an all or nothing approach regarding food. Absolutely, this red flag applies to Eddie. He says that you should not consume non-berry fruit, despite the fact that, as we established, non-berry fruit is safe to eat for most people, among other things. So this red flag applies to him. Red flag number 6 is where an influencer claims that diet can fix a problem when diet cannot fix that problem. Yes, this red flag applies to Eddie. Eddie claims that diet can fix irritable bowel disease, yet Ben Carpenter demonstratively shows that diet cannot fix irritable bowel disease. So there's that, but also Eddie claims that that your diet can fix depression. Yet, as I can tell you from my experience and from the medical literature, diet cannot fix depression. Diet can alleviate to an extent, but diet will not outright cure depression. So Eddie is wrong on that. Red flag number 6 applies to Eddie. A history of lying and hypocrisy? Like we explained in the previous video, yes, Eddie has a history of lying and hypocrisy. So red flag number 7 applies to him. That's 7 out of 7 red flags that apply to Eddie. Accordingly, he is not credible when it comes to nutrition. I do not recommend listening to him if you want good nutritional advice. He's not credible on nutrition. Now let's look at Mario. All right? The first red flag is where an influencer has no education regarding nutrition. Yes, this applies to Mario. From what I can gather, he has no education on nutrition. Whatever education he has is minimal at best. All right, red flag number 2 is where an influencer demonizes a healthy food. This one's a bit debatable on Mario. I would argue it does apply to him because he considers protein supplementation to be unhealthy, despite the fact that the data clearly shows that protein supplementation is healthy. So I would argue this red flag does apply to him, but this one's a bit debatable. Red flag number 3 is where an influencer criticizes processed food as being unhealthy with no context or nuance. Yes, this applies to Mario. He argues that you shouldn't consume heavily processed food, which includes protein supplementation, yet he hypocritically tells his audience to eat heavily processed candy before working out, which is a little weird. Red flag number 4 is where an influencer dismisses protein supplementation as being unhealthy. Yes, this applies to Mario. Red flag number 4 applies to him. Red flag number 5 is where an influencer has an all or nothing approach regarding nutrition. Yes, this applies to Mario, as he argues that you shouldn't consume any heavily processed food at all, including protein supplements. Red flag number 6 doesn't apply to Mario. All right, so we're not going to talk about that. It's not relevant to him. Red flag number 7, as we discussed in this video, yes, he has a history of lying and hypocrisy. So red flag number 7 applies to Mario. All right, at least 5 red flags apply to Mario, and possibly 6 if you count the second one. Accordingly, Mario is not credible on nutrition. He's not credible on nutrition, and anything he says is baloney. So he's not a good source of education regarding nutrition.